The Blue Man on the River. From Kai 555. It was 2009. My family was at the local park, celebrating my older sister's graduation with friends and relatives. We lived in a small rural town, so the park was a modest place. A few pavilions, a playground, and a volleyball court. But beyond that, a large mass of dark trees. Dense forest lined the river's edge with a few narrow hiking trails that disappeared into the trees. I was 7 or 8 at the time, and like always, my siblings and I ran free, unsupervised by our negligent parents. So it was no surprise when no one noticed I wandered off alone. But that never bothered me. I was a farm kid, used to exploring nature by myself. As I walked, the sounds of the party faded, and soon all I could hear was the woods. Just the birds chirping and the buzzing of mosquitoes. I followed the trail until I reached a part of the riverbank I'd never seen before. The water roared and rushed with the current. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth. I crouched, distracted by the scuttling insects and the smooth river stones, when movement, caught my eye across the water. I looked up. There was a man standing on an old wooden raft in the middle of the river. He was tall, too, very tall. He gripped a long pole guiding a cluster of logs downstream through a vicious current, and yet his raft stayed completely stationary, almost as if it were floating above the water rather than on it. I wasn't expecting to see anyone on the river, but what unsettled me here was his appearance. He looked like an old-time lumberjack, dressed in muddy, faded clothes and a tattered red flannel. His beard was wild and blonde, but his skin... Now this was strange. His skin was blue. Not pale, not cold, but vividly blue, like the color of a summer sky or cheap carnival face paint. I stared, not believing what I was seeing. Then he turned, and he saw me. His grin stretched wide, too wide, teeth flashing in the gray daylight. He shouted something, but the roar of the water drowned out his words. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lifted a hand and beckoned me. The river separated us, so I couldn't obey him even if I'd wanted to. And some small primal instinct, warned me not to even try. I was gripped by fear, and so I ran, going back down the trail towards my family. When I told my siblings, nearly out of breath, what I'd seen, 2 of them were excited and insisted we go back to find the man. When we returned, the river was empty. No raft, no logs, and no blue man. This memory has stuck with me ever since, especially considering that this park was only 10 minutes away from my house. I tended to avoid that park afterwards. I'm not sure what I saw. No one else in town has ever spoken of strange figures out on the river. No old ghost stories and no whispered legends. When I asked my siblings if they remember the blue man on the water, they had no recollection of the event. But I do. I still remember him and his weird skin, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Something in the woods tried to take me. From Anderson. This happened to me when I was 11, back in 2003. I swear every word is true. My dad and uncle were completely obsessed with unexplained disappearances in national parks. You know, those strange missing person cases where hikers and campers just vanish without a trace in the wilderness. They would spend hours talking about this stuff around campfires, theorizing about what could be taking people. My dad was convinced it was something supernatural. My uncle leaned toward the idea of some undiscovered predator in the woods. They'd go back and forth about these theories all the time. As a kid, all it did for me was scare the living daylights out of me. But they never seemed to notice or care. This one summer, my dad, uncle, and I went camping in the Ozarks. We'd gone to this same spot for years before. A little clearing about half a mile from any marked trails. It was early June at the time, and unusually cool for that year. The first 2 days were normal. Fishing and hiking, my dad and uncle drinking beer and talking about their missing person cases late into the night, while I pretended not to listen from my own tent. On the third night, I fell asleep to the sound of them discussing a famous case about some little boy who disappeared during a family camping trip, only to be found about 15 miles away a couple of days later, with no memory of what happened. I recall having nightmares about being lost in the woods, unable to find my way back to camp. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was another nightmare, but then I realized something was actually happening. The zipper on my tent was being opened from the outside. I was groggy, still half asleep, but I remember feeling paralyzed with fear. Then I saw something. A very large, hairy arm reaching into my tent. I couldn't see much else in the darkness, but I could make out the dark hair or fur that covered the arm. It grabbed me by the ankle and began to pull me. Now, everyone handles being terrified differently. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run or fight, but what my body chose to do was tense up and let it happen. I was a kid scared out of his mind, probably in shock, so I hope you don't blame me. The thing dragged me out of my tent and then picked me up. I remember being carried like a sack of potatoes, tucked under its arm. I felt coarse hair against my skin. It smelled all wild and musky, like wet dog amped up to the maximum level. I had never been so scared before, but all I could do was go limp, closing my eyes tight, hoping it really was just a dream. I could hear the thing breathing, heavy and controlled and very slow. Not the panting of an animal, but not quite human either. It carried me deeper into the woods. I don't know exactly how far, but later we figured it was about 50 yards from the campsite. I remember branches whipping past me as it moved quickly through the underbrush. Then, all at once, the creature stopped. Something had changed. The creature tensed up. It made a strange huffing sound, then carefully, almost gently even, placed me down on the forest floor. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, terrified of what I might see if I opened them, or what might happen. I then began to hear it moving away quickly, branches breaking as it retreated. Whatever it was in a hurry, like something had spooked it, or it had changed its mind. I lay there curled up into a ball, still too horrified to move an inch. I could barely even breathe. Eventually, I passed out. Maybe I fell back to sleep from pure exhaustion. But when I woke up, it was early morning. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees. I lay exactly where the creature had left me, deep in the woods, away from our campsite. My pajamas were torn and dirty. There were leaves in my hair and scratches on my arms and legs from being carried through the brush. It hit me then, like a truck. That had not been a dream, even if I'd wanted it to be. I started to cry then, and I screamed for my dad. It only took a minute or two for them to come out and find me. They'd been frantically searching the area since discovering I was missing from my tent. When they asked me what happened, I said everything that I knew. I expected them to tell me it was just a nightmare, that I sleepwalked into the woods. But they didn't do that. They exchanged this look I'll never forget. Part fear and part vindication. Like they'd been expecting something like this to happen eventually. Kinda messed up that it happened to me. We packed up and left immediately. On the drive home, they made me promise never to tell my mom what happened. They said she would not understand, that it would only scare her. So I kept quiet. Years later, when I was in college, I asked my dad about that night. He admitted they chose that exact camping spot because there had been reports of strange encounters in the area. It clicked for me then. I think they were using me as bait, a way to test their theories. Ever since that conversation, I haven't spoken to my dad. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened to me if that thing had not been spooked by something. Where was it taking me? Would I still be alive? The way I see it now, my name would probably be a headline on multiple YouTube videos about unsolved missing person cases. I have no idea what carried me away that night, but I just don't like to think about it. Dragger on the Bay, from D.B. Compton. I grew up in a small, modest house right on the edge of Lake Superior in northern Minnesota. The shoreline there wasn't sandy or inviting like the beaches you see in vacation photos. It was rocky and wild, with large, smooth stones that had been worn down by centuries of waves crashing against them. Behind our property stretched a dense forest of pine and birch trees that seemed to go on forever. I spent most of my childhood playing along that rocky shore, climbing over boulders, collecting interesting pebbles, and wading into the frigid water on hot summer days. My parents weren't wealthy by any means. My dad worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local paper mill, and my mom was a part-time librarian in our tiny town. But what we lacked in money, we made up for with the incredible backyard that nature had provided us. That shoreline was my playground, my sanctuary. At least it was until the summer of 1997, when I was 10 years old. The events I'm about to describe changed my relationship with the lake forever. Even now, nearly 30 years later, I can't look at large bodies of water without feeling a chill run down my spine, wondering what might be watching me from beneath the surface. It started on an early June morning. I had woken up before my parents, as I often did during summer vacation, eager to get outside and explore. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the lake's surface. As I made my way down our well-worn path to the shore, something unusual caught my eye. A strange pattern in the gravelly sand near the water's edge. There were what looked like handprints, though not quite human, on either side of a wide drag mark that led from the water up toward the forest. The prints were about the size of my dad's hands, but with longer, more slender fingers, or what I assumed were fingers. The drag mark between them was about 2 feet wide and had disturbed the small rocks and pebbles along the shore. I followed the trail with my eyes to where it disappeared into the underbrush at the forest's edge. Something had pulled itself out of the water and into the woods. I wasn't sure whether to be scared or intrigued. When my dad came outside with his morning coffee about an hour later, I showed him the strange trail. "Dad, look at this. What do you think made it?" I asked, pointing at the prints and drag mark. He crouched down, examining the pattern with a furrowed brow. After a moment, he shrugged and took a sip of his coffee. "Probably just an animal that caught a fish and hauled it back into the forest," he said casually. "Maybe a bear or something dragging its catch. Nothing to worry about, buddy." His explanation made sense, and I tried to convince myself that he was right. Bears weren't uncommon in our area, though we rarely saw them near our house. Still, something about those handprints didn't look like any bear tracks I'd ever seen in my illustrated wildlife books. The next few days brought more of the same strange trails, always appearing overnight, always showing the same pattern of handprints on either side of a drag mark. Some led from the water into the woods, others from the woods back to the water. They appeared in different spots along our shoreline, never in the same place twice. Even my dad grew perplexed as the days went on. I could tell by the way he would stand quietly studying the marks, his coffee growing cold in his hand, that he was troubled by them. "I've never seen anything like this," he finally admitted on the 5th morning, as we stood looking at yet another set of tracks. "Could be some kind of water animal I'm not familiar with. The conservation office might know." But he never called them. I think part of him didn't want to know what was visiting our shoreline in the night. By the end of the week, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I was determined to see whatever creature was making these tracks with my own eyes. On Friday night, after my parents had gone to bed, I snuck out of my room with a flashlight and a blanket. I set myself up on our screened porch, which had a perfect view of the shoreline, and prepared for a long night of watching and waiting. For hours, nothing happened. The lake lapped gently against the shore. The moon cast silver ripples across the water's surface, and occasionally an owl would hoot from the forest behind me. My eyes grew heavy, and despite my determination, I found myself struggling to stay awake. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I jolted awake, unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The porch was dark, my flashlight had rolled away and turned off, and the night had grown eerily quiet. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, just the gentle sound of water against rock. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a disturbance in the water, about 15 feet from shore. Then a shape began to emerge, a long, slender, tapered body, darkly colored and glistening wet in the moonlight. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet long. The creature pulled itself onto the rocks using 2 limbs that extended from what I assumed was its front end. They were unmistakably arm-like, ending in what looked like hands with elongated fingers. It moved slowly, with eerie purpose, dragging its body across the rocky shore, with those strange front limbs, leaving exactly the kind of trail I'd been finding. As it pulled itself further onto land, I could hear it breathing, a raspy, labored sound that was somehow both fish-like and mammalian. I was frozen, partly in terror, partly in awe. This was no bear, no animal I'd ever seen or read about. It didn't move like anything that belonged on land, yet it wasn't entirely a creature of the water either. It seemed to exist in some horrifying in-between state. The creature paused at the edge of the forest, lifting what must have been its head and seeming to scent the air. I ducked down, terrified it might see me. But it didn't turn toward the house. Instead, it continued into the woods, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. I should have gone back to my room then, locked the door, and told my parents everything in the morning. But some morbid fascination kept me there on the porch, wrapped in my blanket, waiting to see if the thing would return. I must have dozed off again, because the next thing I knew, the sky was beginning to lighten ever so slightly with the first hint of dawn. I rubbed my eyes and looked toward the shore. And that's when I saw it again, returning from the forest, moving back toward the water. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see it was carrying something in its mouth. Something small and furry, possibly a rabbit or a squirrel. The creature dragged itself and its prey back to the water's edge, then slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple, taking its meal with it. I sat there, shaking, until the sun had fully risen. When my parents woke up, I told them I'd gotten up early to watch the sunrise, not daring to mention what I'd seen. I didn't have the words to describe it, and I feared they wouldn't believe me anyway. For weeks afterward, I continued to find the tracks, but I never again stayed up to watch for the creature. I told myself that what I'd seen was just a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much imagination and too little sleep. Sometimes I almost believed it. Then in late August, everything changed. My parents had gone into town for some last-minute back-to-school shopping, leaving me at home with strict instructions to go to bed by 9. but it was a warm night, and the house felt stuffy, so I decided to sneak outside for just a few minutes before turning in. I sat on our back porch steps, enjoying the cool breeze coming off the lake. That's when I heard it, a soft splashing sound from the water. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the shore, drawn by some inexplicable need to see the creature again. The moon was full that night, casting enough light to see. About 20 feet from shore, I spotted something moving slowly through the water, a long tapered tail swaying lazily from side to side. It wasn't thrashing or splashing, just moving steadily, rhythmically. Then, closer to shore, I saw it, the top of a head just breaking the surface, and two eyes. Two eyes that were staring directly at me. They reflected the moonlight with an eerie yellowish glow, unblinking and fixed on my small figure, standing at the water's edge. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was standing there, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature, and the next I was tearing across the yard toward our back door. A scream caught in my throat. I burst into the house, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. Then I ran through the house, locking all the doors and windows, pulling all the curtains closed. I didn't dare look outside, convinced that if I did, I would see that thing dragging itself toward our house, toward me. I huddled in my bedroom, lights on, too terrified to move, until I heard my parents' car in the driveway around 10:30. I didn't go out to greet them. I didn't tell them what had happened. I was afraid they'd be angry that I'd disobeyed their instructions to go to bed on time, and I was even more afraid they wouldn't believe me about what I'd seen. So I lay in my bed, listening to them move around the house, taking comfort in the sound of their voices, the normality of their presence. Only after I heard them go to bed did I finally drift into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my dad calling my name. There was an edge to his voice that made me leap out of bed and rush downstairs. He was standing at the back door, looking out toward the shore. "Come take a look at this," he said when he saw me. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. When I looked outside, I saw them, those now familiar handprints on either side of a drag mark. But this time, they didn't lead into the forest. They led straight up to our house, right to the window of my bedroom, then back to the water. My dad turned to me, his face pale. Any idea what could have made these? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. What could I have said? That a creature from the lake had crawled up to my window in the night to look at me while I slept? Even now, the idea sounds absurd, impossible. My parents called the conservation office that day. 2 officers came out, took pictures of the tracks, and asked a lot of questions. They suggested it might be a large snapping turtle, or maybe even an alligator that someone had illegally kept as a pet and released into the lake when it got too big. But their explanations rang hollow, and I could tell they didn't really believe them either. For months afterward, I refused to go near the shore, especially as the days grew shorter and darkness came earlier. I kept my window locked and my curtains drawn at night. Gradually, the tracks stopped appearing, and life slowly returned to normal. By the following summer, I had convinced myself that I could play along the shoreline again, but only when the sun was high in the sky, casting no shadows where creatures could hide. I never again ventured near the water at dawn, dusk, or night. Years passed, and I eventually moved away from that house by the lake. My parents stayed until they retired, then sold the place to a young family with kids about the age I'd been when it all happened. Sometimes I wonder if those children play along the shore, and if they ever see strange tracks in the morning, or glimpse something watching them from the water. Shadows in the Dark. From Gearhead 993. The following story may seem kind of outlandish, but it is 100% true, to the best that my memory will allow. I recently started to see a psychiatrist who specializes in dream interpretation, because I've been having some dreams I can't really explain, which, in doing so, has brought to light some childhood trauma that I had otherwise forgotten about. When I was a kid, I had a pretty severe case of night terrors. So much so that the only way I was able to sleep was having background noise, such as a radio or movie playing on the TV at low volume. They started not long after I was diagnosed with leukemia. Yep, I'm a cancer survivor. I was probably 4 or 5 years old at the time, so bear with me, as some of these memories are a little fuzzy. Around the summer of 1998, I was diagnosed with acute lymphocytic leukemia. When they told me I had cancer, I was too little to really know what it truly meant. I mean, how do you explain the possibility of death to a 4-year-old? Needless to say, I was blind to what was truly going on. That is, until the shadows began to appear. Fast forward a few weeks. One night, I was lying in the hospital for treatments I was being given. I began to see things I couldn't quite explain. Talking to Mom and Dad didn't do much because, well, who's gonna believe a 4-year-old that's seeing shadows in the dark? They chalked it up to a young boy's wild imagination. I tried to tell my dad that something was in the room with us, but all I got from him was, "Calm down, son, nothing is here. Go back to sleep." So I covered my face and pretended it wasn't there. And oddly enough, that seemed to solve the problem. At least, for a little while. The next few days went by without incident. But then everything came to a head. One of the last nights I was in the hospital, I had a pretty trying day. The doctors had given me my next dose of chemotherapy, and it was affecting me hard. I spent most of the day in and out of sleep, so by the time the evening drew upon us, you can safely assume that sleep was the last thing on my mind. As tired as I was, sleeping through the day messed up my sleep pattern, so I was pretty wide awake by dark. Dad had rented some movies for us to watch, so I decided to put one in and give it a watch as Mom and Dad caught up on some much-needed rest. While lying there that evening, I began to see something out of the corner of my eye. Just a glimpse, and then it was gone. Then again and again. I began to grow annoyed, so I went over to turn on the bathroom light, and when I did, I turned, and I saw a dark, shadowy figure standing in front of me. It appeared to be a humanoid-looking figure. The only identifying features the figure had was it appeared to have a fedora and a walking cane. And there were eyes. Eyes glowing a bright, piercing red color that appeared to be like fire. I know this because these features also resembled the character Judge Doom from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, coincidentally, I'd also watched for the very first time earlier that day. At least, the bits and pieces I was awake for, that is. I'd wanted to see this movie because Roger Rabbit was also a character that appeared as a cameo in the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movies, which were a favorite of mine at the time. As I stood there with this shadowy figure staring down at me, I froze in panic. I didn't know what to do. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed muted. I was talking, but nothing came out. I tried to move then, but my limbs were frozen. My own body was not behaving as it should. Suddenly, I saw the figure raise its cane to its face as if to shush me. Then it spoke in a voice that seemed to slice through the room like a knife. "Silence." it said with a slithering voice like that of a snake. "You are going to die," the voice said, echoing through the night. Suddenly, without warning, it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. I found myself back in my bed, waking up in a cold sweat, as if I had just been dunked into a pool. The monitors reading my vitals by the bed began to blare, sending off signals that sent nurses rushing into my room. My whole body was quivering in my mom's arms uncontrollably. After several minutes of diagnosing my condition, they decided to give me a sedative due to my elevated level of distress. When I awoke later, they told me I woke up screaming that I was going to die. They said my blood pressure was reading stroke levels, that if they had not gotten there sooner, I could have gone into a stress-induced coma. I wish I could say that things ended there, and although I never saw the shadow figure after that, there were on-again, off-again episodes where I'd catch a glimpse here, a glimpse there, just out of the corner of my eyes, just enough to know it was watching me. To this day, I have no idea what the shadow in the dark wanted from me. So why it chose me to haunt that fateful night, I don't know. My psychiatrist seems to think it was my subconscious finally putting pieces together that I was likely not going to survive leukemia. And who knows, maybe they're right. Looking back on it now, telling this story, I know it seems outlandish, and there are certain points that add up to a logical explanation. It could have been just something brought on by watching a movie a little 4-year-old should not have been watching. Add that together with the stress I was under fighting a terminal illness. Sure, 2 + 2 = 4, I get it. I don't expect everyone to believe this crazy story. Heck, I'm still not convinced as an adult that I didn't just have a nightmare, or that I finally figured out in my head that I really was going to die. So whatever you choose to believe, I'll leave that up to you. All I can say is thanks for letting me tell my story. And to the shadow in the dark that haunted me that night, if you're still out there somewhere, I just have one thing to say to you. I lived. Picher, Oklahoma is haunted. From MrWest.com. This story happened when I was 4 or 5 years old. It was the early 90s and my family was living in a small town, Picher, Oklahoma. It was an old mining town, long thought to be haunted. And I believe it. It was pretty much destroyed years ago by a tornado, and it's a ghost town now. Everyone in my family had some sort of encounter there. My dad was working in his office one day, and a shadowy figure suddenly walked in and sat at the seat across from him. He even tried to speak to it, but didn't get an answer. And when he stood up, it vanished. My mom and her friend saw a man in an old plaid shirt walk into the church sanctuary where they were, and then just vanish. My sister had a supposedly imaginary friend named Michael that she was terrified of, as he delighted in scaring her. And then there's my story. I was in my bedroom trying to sleep. I think I'd been lying there at least an hour or more, but was struggling. Hard to say for sure, I was so young. Anyway, as I lay there, I suddenly heard a moaning sound from under my bed. It was deep and guttural, almost like a choked moan. The sound terrified me. I had no idea what it was. At the time, I shared a room with my sister. We had bunk beds. She was sound asleep above me on the top bunk, and I'd known for a fact she hadn't come down. Then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked and saw a pale, young-looking girl crawling out from under the bed, making that horrible sound. Her head was turned where she was facing the ceiling, but she continued crawling closer and up onto my bed. I was petrified. Then suddenly, Her neck made a cracking sound, and it turned right at me. We made eye contact. She leaned in and screamed right in my face. I screamed back. I blacked out. Next thing I knew, I was waking up for the morning. I told my mom what happened. She humored me, saying she'd thrown the ghost out. We moved out of that house not long after, and I eventually convinced myself it had just been a dream, until I grew older. My parents told me some things I didn't know. The family that lived in the house before us had a teenage daughter. The room I saw the ghost in had been her room, and it was the room where she took her own life. The news shocked me, of course, but it got worse. My parents knew the people who had the house after us. Picher was one of those small towns where you pretty much knew everybody. And apparently, those people had 2 sons who shared that room. The family didn't stay long, as the 2 boys refused to sleep in that room because of the scary lady in the closet. I'm convinced I was never dreaming. I'll never forget her face, and that awful moaning and choking. She appears in my nightmares sometimes, even today. That house is long gone now, one of the many homes demolished after Picher was shut down, and perhaps that's for the best. Hopefully that spirit is at peace, and won't scare anyone else, assuming nothing else is ever built there in the future. However, when I do drive by the old place every few years, I still get a really sinister vibe from it. Is it old memories? Or do the spirits of that town still run wild? They lived in the ceiling. From Tired Mama JFC. When I was young, I lived with my grandmother who adopted me. We lived in this old school building that had been converted into a huge apartment complex. Now, even with me being so young, I remember random things about the place. Like how there was a Coke machine right outside our apartment door that sold my favorite soda, vanilla Coke. Or how the husband and wife that lived in the apartment next to ours always argued. They even would end up in the hallway at times, throwing glass plates and glass cups at each other. I genuinely don't understand how they were allowed to live there. I remember how musty the entire building seemed to smell. But the one thing I remember most of all was the people that lived in our ceiling. Let me start this by saying between each floor of the apartments, there were small gaps between the ceiling of one apartment and the floor of the apartment above. I'm not entirely sure why they were made that way, but I digress. I'm not a carpenter, nor do I have the knowledge of construction crews and such. Most people in the apartments would remove the ceiling panels and store small things up there. I vividly remember my grandmother storing blankets and other light things up there, just to get them out of the way. I never thought anything of it in my little kid's brain, mostly because it seemed normal enough. One day, my grandmother was in the kitchen cooking lunch for the 2 of us. I was sitting on the futon in the living room, watching something on this old tube TV. When I say old, I mean old. The thing was heavy, bulky, and the outside of it was made of wood. Anyway, as I sat there watching something stupid, I'm sure, probably like Dora or something along those lines, I kept hearing what sounded like humming. Now, another thing you should know about these apartments was that the walls were so thin that you could practically hear the conversation of neighbors all the time. So I was very used to hearing mumbling and such. But that particular day, I was drawn to the ceiling tile that my grandmother used when accessing the storage in the ceiling. I walked across the room and stood directly under the ceiling tile, just staring up at it. It was weird. I remember feeling like I couldn't move. But then, I saw the ceiling tile lift. Just as that happened, my grandmother walked into the living room carrying our lunch on trays, and it sort of knocked me out of this trance I was in. A few days go by, and I once again hear what sounded like humming or mumbling coming from the ceiling. This time my grandmother was sitting beside me, watching I Love Lucy, and when I started staring at the ceiling, she took notice. "Honey, what are you looking at?" my grandmother asked, as I once again made my way across the living room, fixated on the ceiling tile. "I hear someone in the ceiling," I said, nonchalantly, standing directly under that tile again. My grandmother, obviously worried, pulled her little ladder over and climbed up it, pushing the tile back and going into the ceiling until just from her ribs down was showing. "Baby girl, I don't see anything up here," came my grandmother's muffled voice before she climbed back down, looking at me with this worried expression. And so it began. For the next 2 weeks or so, I'd hear voices or see the tile move, and my grandmother was always out of the room doing whatever. She'd come back to find me just staring up at the ceiling. Until one day, my grandmother and I were sitting on the couch watching TV when we both heard the tile move. Both our eyes shot up to the ceiling as the tile began to move. My grandmother, being the very brave and absolutely stubborn woman that she was, goes rushing over to the ladder and climbs up, pushing the tile out of the way. "I don't know who the heck you are, but you need to get out of my house," she yelled as she ascended the ladder, only to come back down a few minutes later looking puzzled. "There's no one up there," she said to me with a puzzled look. She goes to the kitchen and calls my dad, and as she's explaining everything to him, talking to him about coming to the apartment so he could do a double check, I sat on the couch staring at the ceiling. I watched as the ceiling tile slowly but surely started to move to where there was a tiny crack, making the between floor visible. That's also when I let out a blood-curdling scream, because in that crack, I saw two eyes that were staring at me. My grandmother comes rushing into the living room, and she lets out a gasp as she too sees the two eyes staring at us from the ceiling. She yells at my dad that we were leaving, and she grabbed me by the arm and yanked my sobbing body out of the apartment. We didn't go back. Not for a few days, anyway. We stayed at my dad's house until he and my uncle went and investigated themselves, only to come out empty-handed, saying not a single thing was up there, save for the things my grandmother stored. Finally, my grandmother was brave enough to go back to the apartment, and I remember us coming through the door, my grandmother going rushing to the bathroom while I very slowly and cautiously walked into the living room. What I came across still gives me goosebumps to this day. In the side of that wooden TV was a skull and crossbones carved into it. Underneath, carved into the TV, were these very small but sloppy letters that spelled out the word, "Leave." And we did. Once my grandmother saw that, she went rushing around packing our bags and we left. My dad and uncle did another sweep of the apartment, trying to find out what was in the ceiling as they packed up the remainder of our things. They once again came up empty-handed. That building was later rumored to be haunted. That being said, I do have another ghost story that happened there. I'm not sure what happened there for there to be ghosts or entities, whatever you want to call them. But I know one thing for sure. 23 years later, and you still won't catch me walking into that building for anything. Werewolf Pups. From The Quacker 8301. I've been debating on whether to tell this story for a while, and I've decided to finally share it. This happened to my father and I a long time ago, when I was still in middle school. My dad and I would often take camping trips whenever I had a break from school. One winter break, my dad and I went on one of our signature camping trips at a new campsite. Allow me to apologize here, because I can't recall the name of the campsite for the life of me, and my dad doesn't remember either. So, weird things started to happen the first day. While my dad was finishing setting up the camp, I was roaming around near a small creek. Next to that creek, I found some huge paw prints. They looked canine, but longer, almost stretched, and I could very clearly see long claw marks at the end of the prints. It had just rained recently, so I was able to see the prints clearly. I showed these to my dad, and he too was astonished by how large the prints were. But eventually, we chalked it up to coyotes moving through. The second day, while exploring that very same creek, I came across huge, and I mean huge, claw marks scraped across the tree. I remember standing in front of them, racking my brain as I wondered what could have made them. They were really high up on the tree, about 8 feet up or so, and they looked quite fresh. I also began noticing that, at night, the wildlife around here would get very quiet. No hooting owls or chirping crickets, just dead silence. Sometimes late at night I'd hear these really drawn-out howls. They sounded like wolves, but somehow human. It's hard to describe, really. It's like if you took the groan of a man and the howl of a wolf and mixed them together. They were usually very faint and lasted for a couple of minutes at most, so I paid them no mind. All of these events were overshadowed by all the fun I was having. My dad and I were having a great time, fishing, hiking, enjoying each other's company, without being glued to any screens. Then came the 5th night. I recall it had a full moon, and the stars in the sky that night were so clear. My dad and I were sitting next to the fire. He was telling me stories from his childhood, when suddenly we heard a twig snap. The two of us paused, looking in the direction of the noise. My dad stood up and quickly gestured for me to get behind him. I expected to see a coyote or even a deer walk out. But what I did see, I'll never forget. 2 figures. One was 6 feet maybe, and the other was a bit smaller. They walked, or rather stumbled out. I couldn't believe my eyes. My dad's eyes even widened. The creatures looked like dogs or wolves, but they were standing on hind legs, like people. And they had hands instead of paws, with elongated limbs. But what led me to believe they were pups or juveniles was the other figure emerging behind them. The same kind of creature, but much larger. 8 feet at least. That must be the parent, I thought. God, I can still remember those eyes, yellow and piercing. The parent wolf scanned me, and my dad, before it literally scooped up the smallest of the pups in its hands, like a human mother would to her babies, and stood protectively over the other one. She let out a deep bark-like sound, and the small family crept back into the woods, disappearing almost as quickly as they had appeared. We packed up right after that. After I discovered this channel, the memories resurfaced, and I thought it was finally time to share mine and my dad's encounter. Stay safe in the woods. Was I attacked by a demon? From Broken Kit Kat. My whole life has been filled with supernatural occurrences, but the one that was the most haunting to me is something that happened when I was 13. During the summer, I was usually up and out late at night with some friends around our small town in central Canada. This particular night, myself and 2 friends, who I'll call A and T, decided to go to a park across town from my house at around 2 or 3 a.m. This park had some basic exercise equipment, rather than swings or kid-friendly jungle gyms. The park had bushes and trees surrounding the edge to separate it from the houses and nearby businesses. My friends were on one of the machines. I believe it was for an ab workout, as you just swung side to side. I suddenly got a weird hot feeling rush through my body, and while it was summer, I felt like I was in blistering heat, but it was maximum plus 16 Celsius that night. I looked up, and in the bush along the edge near where we were, I saw red eyes. Instantly, I got very uncomfortable, and I told my friends what I saw. They blew it off, saying it was probably a dog, and laughed at me. I tried to brush it off and agree with them, when suddenly we heard a strange growl and the leaves of the bush rustling. My friends, suddenly, without saying a word, took off running across the street towards a school. I went to run after them, but only ran maybe 6 feet before I tripped and fell on my face. The moment I landed, I felt whatever was there scratch the back of my left calf bad enough to make me bleed. I struggled to get up, as it felt like whatever this being was had a hold of my left ankle. I looked back to see, and while I couldn't physically see anything there, I instantly got an image in my mind of what it looked like. The only way I could describe it was its body looked like an incredibly pale, emaciated, hairless dog, and it could walk on hind legs. Its hands had long, spindly fingers with sharp nails, and its head was more the shape of a man. It didn't have eyes or a nose, but it did have a giant gaping mouth with these sharp teeth. It looked slimy or wet, and probably stood about 7 feet tall. I managed to get up and out of its grasp, and I ran as fast as I could to meet up with my friends at the school. My friend A said she thinks it's following us, and we ran through the parking lot to the playground behind the school. The playground had 2 different play structures, one older one directly behind the school, and a newer one off to the side by a swing set along the fence line. We very poorly tried to hide on the older play structure, all huddling together under one of the stairs leading up to the structure. I started to show my friends the scratch on the back of my leg and describe what I saw, and that's when T started to get very scared. Suddenly, the air got really hot and felt heavy again. My friend A started to act off, and again, not saying a word, left the huddle and started to walk up the stairs of the play structure. T and I thought she was ignoring us when we asked her what was going on. Not wanting to move, but worried about our friend, T and I followed A, calling out, trying to get some sort of answer. A ended up climbing to the highest point of the play structure, which was what we called the fireman pole. She stood on top of the arch holding the pole in place, and as we were screaming for her to get down, she jumped down, landing in the gravel sitting on her legs. T and I ran down to the bottom as fast as we could to see if A was okay. We found her still sitting in the gravel, rocking side to side. As soon as A came to, she freaked out and asked what was happening. We explained what she had just done and checked her over for injuries, but scarily, she had none. Not even a single cut or bruise from the rocks she had landed in. We all felt the air get very heavy again, and very quickly decided to run across town back to my house by 4 a.m. I've told this story to a countless number of people, and no one can figure out what the creature was, or have even heard or seen of something similar, except for an ex who told me an old neighbor of mine told him of a similar thing. He said my old neighbor has seen it running around town every so often, but didn't know anything else. One day I'll eventually run into that neighbor again, and I'll finally ask him about it. Until then, it'll remain a terrifying mystery.